Righty, thank you very much for that introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, which is pretty much everyone in this room, my name's Alex, and over the past 12 months I've been looking at the potential to use Scapolite as a vectoring tool towards mineralisation, which has been my honours project, which I've been doing at JCU. So this is part of the much larger magnet fertility project, which is being kindly funded by the Geological Survey of Queensland. And today what I'm going to be presenting was essentially my exit seminar, which I've cut down a little bit to the more relevant information. So just a little overview of what I'll talk about today. I'll quickly go over the aims of the study. I'll talk a bit about the regional and local geology, talk about some petrography I did, a bit of geochemistry, and then the explanations and some conclusions that I've come to from all that. So just before I get into the aims of the study, I just want to talk about why we thought Scapolite might be useful in a study like this. So Scapolite is stable over a range of metamorphic conditions and is thus widespread across the Mary Kathleen Domain and the greater Mount Isa Inlier. It's capable of incorporating multiple volatile phases such as CO3, SO4 and chlorine, which have the potential to reflect different fluids. This next point, the partition coefficient for chlorine-bromine between scapolite and a coexisting fluid is approximately 1. What this means is if you crystallize a scapolite out of a fluid, the scapolite will reflect the composition of the fluid in terms of chlorine-bromine exactly, and then you can correlate chlorine-bromine ratios to different types of fluids. For example, magmatic fluid generally has a chlorine-bromine greater than 700, whereas a bit and brine fluid would generally have a chlorine-bromine ratio around 1 to 300 or something like that. So another thing is a few papers have found that Scapolite is capable of incorporating many trace elements, including those transition metals I've got listed there. So with that in mind, the aims and objectives of this study, the sort of primary aim was to test if Scapolite, geochemical changes in Scapolite could be used to vector towards mineralisation. We also wanted to see if Scapolite geochemistry could indicate the presence of fertile fluids, for example, if it was capable of incorporating significant copper. And we also wanted to test if Scapolite geochemistry could indicate the presence of igneous fluids, which much of the mineralisation, I guess, in the Eastern Succession is attributed to. So with that in mind, our objectives were to characterise and group Scapolite based on their geochemistry and the petrography, see if we had multiple generations or a single generation, etc. We wanted to derive a genetic model for how the Scapolite formed, and then we wanted to derive a paragenetic sequence for Scapolite relative to the other minerals in the assemblages it forms in, as well as a deformation and alteration. So I'll brush over this quite quickly. Regional geology, that's the exposed Mount Isa Inlier. My field zone is, so the Mary Kathleen Domain is the north-south extending green domain there, and my study area is in that little box. So to zoom into that box, this is a map of the local geology, and a couple of things I just want to point out as I'm going forward in this presentation would be the Elaine Dorothy deposit, which is sort of like my hub of mineralisation, which I'm looking to vector towards. That's basically highlighted by the little inset there. The Mary Kathleen syncline, that's this sort of large structure. You can see the hinge running through the middle, which is producing all the orientations of the form lines there. The Birstall granite, that's that main pink blob to the east. The Mary Kathleen shear, this one's a bit harder, but it's this structure which runs up that way. And the sample locations, which are these multicoloured dots which I have spotted over the place, so the yellow, the red, and the green dots. And I'll get into what those different colours represent as I go forward. So the petrography, through our sort of petrographic study, we identified 3 generations of Scapolite. So the earliest generation is what we consider metamorphic Scapolite. The second generation is a skarn Scapolite. And the third generation is a hydrothermal Scapolite. So to go into each of those individually, the metamorphic Scapolite, these occur in calc-silicates and marble. So the calc-silicate is that green sort of background unit, and the marble is the grey unit which you see sort of wrap around the syncline. So the assemblages that we see in thin section. Image A there, that's a scapolite grain in the marble. Image B, that's a scapolite grain situated away from the burstal granite in a typical calc-silicate assemblage of amphibole and feldspars. Image C and the other image C, these are actually sampled from the contact of the burstal granite. So you see quite a distinct textural change between scapolite from the contact compared with scapolite away from the contact. So a little bit about the textures that we're sort of looking at here, particularly in images A and B. We get this poikiloblastic texture, which we interpret as being a syncrystallization texture. Therefore, we associate these scapolites with metamorphism. Whereas in C, the reduction in grain size, we interpret that as a contact metamorphism, as opposed to the other two, which would be more regional metamorphism. So the next generation is the skarn scapolites. So these are the red dots spotted over the place. So these occur within the garnet and clinopyroxene skarns, which are on the map there are the sort of darkish brown, orange units and the darkish green units. In thin section, this is what they typically look like, so quite different to what we saw in the metamorphic scapolites. Again, we see this poikiloblastic texture, as well as these sort of reaction rings sitting around a majority of these scapolite grains. And what we interpret from that is that, again, these scapolites have crystallized at the same time as the skarn and have thus incorporated much of the skarn assemblage as inclusions. So we think possibly what's actually occurred here is in the rocks which host these skarn scapolites, initially we would have had metamorphic scapolite, and when the skarn has overprinted the metamorphic scapolite, we've had some sort of recrystallization and incorporation of the skarn assemblage. And in image D there, that's just the relationship between a scapolite grain and a hydrothermal overprint, so we see some fracturing running through that scapolite grain, which have been infilled by hydrothermal calcite. So the third and latest generation is the hydrothermal scapolite, and we only identified this at one location, which was that little yellow dot there. These occur as these coarse grain, rare cross-cutting veins, which are clearly underformed. So most of the region has been exposed to amphibolite facies metamorphism. And our interpretation of these being late is because there's no way that these could have been preserved in their current condition, if they had undergone amphibolite facies metamorphism. So generally what we see is fresh crystals towards the walls of the veins, and altered crystals towards the center, which have been replaced by albite, K-feldspar, and epidote. And what's interesting with these hydrothermal scapolite is their association with hydrothermal calcite, as well as copper oxide and copper carbonate mineralization. So we think there's a potential link between the fluid which has crystallized these hydrothermal scapolite, as well as potentially the mineralizing fluid at Elaine Dorothy. So just to move on to a bit of the geochemistry that we did in this study, this figure up here basically depicts the major element chemistry of scapolite. So on the y-axis, this is the solid solution between the two main end members of a scapolite. They are mariolite, a sodium chlorine end member, and mionite, a calcium subcarbonate end member. So what we see is some quite distinct groups between the three generations identified in the petrography. We see hydrothermal scapolite plots quite far towards mariolite. We see that the metamorphic scapolites, they sort of occur in sort of two groups. So this main group here, those are the calc-silicate, the metamorphic scapolites that occur in calc-silicate rocks, whereas that trail leading upwards, those are the ones that occur in the marble. And I guess you would expect that due to the obviously surrounding calcite and likely incorporation of calcium during crystallization. And the skarn scapolites, we see a really wide range, and we think that that is produced likely due to this recrystallization process, producing a range of sort of chemical compositions. So, one of the main aims of this project, of course, was to try and find some kind of geochemical anomaly to vector towards mineralization. And we found one in the form of sulfur. So this graph depicts sulfur against chlorine. Chlorine's a really good way of indicating major element chemistry in scapolites, and sulfur in atoms per formula unit. And what we see is that in those skarns and the hydrothermal scapolite, we have this very obvious increase in sulfur content. And if we actually map this data, this is what we find. So these values here are average atoms per formula unit of sulfur at each sample site. And I think there's quite a clear correlation between the location of the deposit and an elevation in sulfur content. And we think that this sulfur is potentially sourced from a mineralizing fluid, which would have passed through that area to precipitate sulfides. So I should have mentioned earlier is that the Elaine Dorothy prospect, that's a copper-gold IOCG type deposit with plenty of sulfide mineralization. So if we move from sort of the major element chemistry to the trace elements, we wanted to look at copper, of course, to see if we could indicate the presence of fertile fluids. And what we found was copper's sort of present in all the generations of scapolite, so skarn, metamorphic, and hydrothermal. However, this is a logarithmic scale on the Y, and there are 7 or so values which are particularly elevated compared to the rest. And if we, again, map these values, what we find is surrounding the Elaine Dorothy, this is average ppm copper, I believe, at each sample site. And what we find is around Elaine Dorothy, there's really not that great an enrichment in copper, quite uniform with the stuff to the east. However, at that one particular point, sitting right in the middle, that one skarn point, we had an average of 115 ppm copper. So we interpret that as saying that yes, scapolite is capable of indicating fertile fluids, but then we thought, well, why are we not seeing it around the deposit? And the explanation, well, possible explanation for this is that if we actually look back to the sulfur, at that deposit which is enriched in copper, there was absolutely no sulfur. Obviously around the deposit there was high sulfur. So is it possible that in the presence of sulfur, a lot of the copper is being incorporated into sulfides, but in the absence of sulfur, where we have the enrichment in copper, basically the copper is being forced into scapolite. So this figure here is a lot to take in, but essentially I'll run you through it slowly. And what it depicts is the change in chlorine-bromine ratio from the samples. So this whole figure is actually a combination of data from my study, that's the circular data, and some data by Hammerly et al. In 2014, that's the square data. First I'll just focus on my own data. So these are the approximate averages of the 3 different generations. And what we see is what appears to be 3 distinct fluids forming these 3 generations of scapolite. So the metamorphic scapolites, that's the green one again, these plot in this sort of magmatic fluid slash halite bearing fluid, so a halite metamorphic fluid. Hammerly had interpreted scapolites of this similar chemistry as magmatic. However, if you plot the chlorine-bromine data on a map, I think that that's the array of average chlorine-bromine at each site. I believe that if those signatures were magmatic, for example, towards the Burstal granite moving to the west, you would expect to see some sort of distinction between these samples here, for example, and those samples up there, but you don't really see any change in the chemistry. So I think it's more likely that these aren't magmatic fluids and that they're more than likely a metamorphic fluid derived by halite dissolution. So if I just go back to this figure again and move on to the skarn samples, what we see is a significant decrease in chlorine-bromine relative to the metamorphic scapolites, as well as a decrease in the chlorine content. And we interpret that as this recrystallization process which I talked about earlier. Essentially what we think has happened is this calcium-rich skarn fluid has come through, likely recrystallized the scapolite, removing sodium and chlorine, thus decreasing the chlorine content. And once you remove chlorine, your bromine will enrich relative to the chlorine. Therefore, you'll increase the bromine concentration relatively and push the chlorine-bromine to the left in this figure. And that's what we think we're seeing in this sort of trend. And then lastly, we have the hydrothermal scapolites there. They plot at a completely different chlorine-bromine composition to the other two, significantly more bromine enriched. And they plot within the residual sort of brine fluids. Now that's a similar interpretation to what Hammerly had said. However, he had interpreted these brines to have formed way back at around 1740 during sediment, or 1740, 1750 during sedimentation. We know that these scapolites cross-cut the deformation fabrics, which are Eisen fabrics. So these must be at least sort of 1550, 1530 in age, these scapolites. So we think it's unlikely to be the result of residual brines formed during earlier sedimentation. And we're not 100% sure actually what the fluid source of these scapolites are. However, if I look back at this map again, what you see is a pretty close correlation between the location of this scapolite and this shear zone running up here. So it's possible that the fluid that's actually crystallized these scapolites is completely exotic and being transported from somewhere else. And that therefore could actually be a residual brine-like fluid, just transported from a different terrain. So another trace element we looked at which sort of just stood out is the cesium concentration in these scapolites. And I don't have a map for this one, but what we see again is in the skarns, particularly surrounding Elaine Dorothy, as well as the hydrothermal scapolite, that we have this enrichment in cesium, and it appears to be another good vector towards the deposit. Where's the cesium coming from? It's difficult to say. It's possible that the hydrothermal fluid itself, if it has caused, say, mineralization, would have interacted with the skarn scapolites and possibly imparted some cesium or at least interacted with those scapolites. So just to summarize sort of the paragenetic sequence that I came up with, so we have the formation of metamorphic scapolite. Initially, we would have had the formation of regional metamorphic scapolite, followed by that intrusion of the Burstall granite, and then the formation of the contact metamorphic scapolite. There's no distinct change in chemistry, so we don't think there's been the influence of a magmatic fluid in those scapolites. Following that, skarn scapolite formation, likely coming from a distinct fluid which has lowered the chlorine-bromine ratio, as well as a potential interaction with the hydrothermal scapolites, which again would have lowered the chlorine-bromine ratio. And then lastly, that hydrothermal scapolite itself with a very low chlorine-bromine ratio. If this is indeed related to the mineralization at Elaine Dorothy, then we can sort of suggest, at least, that these fluids would not have been magmatic. So just some overall conclusions. Scapolite does have the potential to be used as a vectoring tool towards mineralization, at least at Elaine Dorothy. It's yet to see if it can be used further abroad. Sulfur definitely correlates better than copper with the location of the deposit. Copper in scapolite appears to be much higher in skarns than other rocks. Again, that's sort of a bit iffy, but particularly that one that was situated away from the deposit. Based on the hydrothermal scapolite chemistry, if it is related to mineralization, we could say that igneous fluids are not associated with the mineralization, and that scapolite has potential to indicate the presence of fertile fluids, as we saw through the enrichment of copper. So just to sort of wrap everything up, I just wanted to acknowledge the GSQ for their financial support of the Magma Fertility Project. I'd also like to thank MIM for supporting my project, as well as my accommodation when I was doing my fieldwork. And I'd like to thank the whole team in the Magma Fertility Project, Paul Dirks, Yuan Sunislav, Carl Spandler, Jan Martin, Yambo Chang, Josh Spence, and Trung Lee. So thank you all very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.